Everybody thinks they live in a modern times. My parents thought they lived in the modern times. My grandparents thought they lived in the modern time. Their parents thought that. We think that. I don't look at it as modern or not modern. I think about newer views and older views. And one day, the newer views will be older views. Sometimes that happens quickly, sometimes slowly. But when things change, if we don't change with them, we get left behind. And that is a great challenge for all education systems globally. How do we make our education relevant to young people when times change? I'm going to talk about some of these points tonight. Not all of them, but some of them. And I want to talk about this one. An older view that we were born with a brain that began to die from the day we were born. And much of our life was about preparing for that death and what happens next. But what we know now is that our brains grow from birth. They do not die from birth. And we are discovering new ways to keep our brains working at better and better and better levels. I think there will be a time, newer times, when humans can live to be 150, 200 years or more. Is that good? Is that not good? There's got to be some problems. We will overcrowd. I don't want to live to be 200 if my brain is no longer sharp. I think that is a waste of time. My job is to talk to young people about how their brains work. And I do that by getting them to open a real brain. The brains we use come from sheep. Sheep that were killed for their meat. Rather than waste the brain or put it into cat food or into fertilizer, I get them. I use about 20 to 30,000 sheep brains every year. And students with a plastic butter knife cut it open. And they see that a brain has got lots of odd shapes in it. And we are learning what each of these parts is in control of. A brain is a bit like a car. If you don't have the wheels, it doesn't go. If you have the wheels but you don't have the motor, it doesn't go. So all of these parts work together. And a sheep brain looks like a human brain. The parts look almost the same. That's really cool. My aim is to get students to understand how they work as best as we can. No one really knows, but we're learning. Because if you know how a brain works, then you know how to work it. If you know how our brain works, you can learn in less time, a lot less time, with a lot less effort. So I say to students, who would like to learn what would take you a year to learn in maybe 8 or 9 months? And most students go, yes. Not all students go, yes, but most say, yes. So to understand that, we go a little deeper. We look at what a brain is made of. We have in our brain about 100 billion tiny little cells called neurons that help us to make sense of our world. And they do that through a process we call learning. 100 billion neurons. That is a big number. How big is 100 billion? Well, if you wanted to count from 1 to 100 billion, it would take you about 30,000 years. That's how big that number is. That is incredible. And I've met some people who tell me they're not very smart. And I say, are you kidding? You have 100 billion smart cells. Everyone is smart. It's just how you learn to use your 100 billion neurons. That's what makes the difference. Here's what they look like. It's a bit like your arm. You see, these branches are called dendrites. It is a Greek word meaning branches, and they grow so that we have space for writing memory. You have a book, you write in the book. When you fill the page, you turn the page. When you fill the book, you put that one in the library, get another book. In a brain, when you fill the dendrite, you grow another one. How good is that? Yeah. Imagine a book that grew pages. Trouble is, over your lifetime, how big would that book be? It would reach the clouds. And our head is only this big. So our brain says, okay, we only keep what's important. Everything else, get rid of. Have you ever been introduced to a person? You hear their name, 5 seconds later, you have already forgot their name. Yeah. That is your brain saying, don't waste our time. It's not important to know that person's name. This part here is called an axon. A long cable so we can send information from one neuron to the next. But I want to focus more on those dendrites and how they grow. You see, neurons are only 10% of our brain. The rest is white fat. A special white fat called myelin. And when we are learning something, we produce that white fat so that it becomes a habit. We don't have to think about it anymore. So this is a long neuron that goes from the brain to the bladder. So when we need to go to the bathroom, our brain says, our bladder is filling. We need to go and empty it. But when we're born, that doesn't work because we don't have any white fat. So when we're born, we just go to the toilet everywhere. And then when we're about 2 years old, the brain starts to coat those axons with the white fat. It only does that when you're taught to do something. And it takes 2 to 4 years to learn to do that. But once it's done, you've got it for life. Unless you get an illness called multiple sclerosis or MS. MS takes it all off again. And eventually that person loses all control. They will be in a wheelchair, they will lose speech, they'll lose the lot. Children are fascinated by this Because most of us know that you're going to do most of your myelination when you're just young. What happens in the teenage brain? A different type of cell in the brain brings together teams of neurons. If you have a computer, you know you have RAM. You have some working memory. And if your computer has more RAM and a faster processor, you can have more programs open at once. When we go through our teenage years, the brain brings together teams of neurons like it is making more RAM. And what that does is gives people incredible processing power. The teenage brain is stimulated by questions, connecting things together in new ways, asking why. Why are we living here? Why do we need money? Why are some people downtrodden? And so what the world is trying to do in education for people going through those years of school is to change from an answer-based to a question-based curriculum. We call that middle schooling. It's not easy. Not everyone likes it. It is difficult to assess, to see how students are going compared to others. But that's the philosophy behind that. And this continues to about age 22 to 23. A scientist called Jay Geed, and then another scientist called Deborah Yergelin-Todd confirmed his research to show how white matter in the brain grows. We have so much of it, it triples the weight of our brain from birth to age 22. The blue is actually the white fat. So what this scientist did was he got 1,800 children and he studied their brains for 15 years. And he then made what's called a composite. Put them all together and see what that pattern would look like. So let me play that movie for you. "15 years of myelination to produce an adult brain, with the front part of the brain, the most important for thinking, and the side parts for emotion, the very last to develop." Some people say we are not fully adult until we're age 22 or 23. Other people are saying people under the age of 22 or 23 should not drink alcohol or smoke cigarettes or use other harmful substances because their brains are not fully developed yet. It's very hard to prove that because you can't give someone a lot of alcohol and someone no alcohol and see what happens. You're not allowed to do that, of course. This is the important bit. This is why this matters. Many years ago, there was a civil war in a country called Romania. So in that country, adults killed adults and children were left without parents. And the Romanian government set up what it called its orphanages. Children without parents placed in these big centres with very little stimulation, nothing to read, no languages to learn, very little in toys, play. They were fed, they got to use the bathroom, no cuddles, and they started to die. How can you just die? You die of something. They just died. And so some scientists, one in particular, Dr. Marion Diamond, who wrote a beautiful book called Magic Trees of the Mind. She looked at the brains of these children who had died. And she said, this is what they should look like with their dendrites. This was a kid who had lived in a healthy environment, who had died of an accident, motor vehicle. Then she looked at the kids from the Romanian orphanages and she said, that is what a brain looks like from a very old person who had Alzheimer's disease. Have you heard of Alzheimer's disease? It's a decay of the brain. You literally lose your mind. You forget the names of your sons and daughters. It just goes. She said, you cannot have a 10-year-old look like that. The world will not believe me. So she set up an experiment using rats because, like humans, they have dendrites. And you can train a rat to do stuff. And when you train it, it grows more of these. And you can measure it. You can take a little bit of brain called a biopsy and study it. You can't even feel it. Brain surgery is sometimes done when the person is awake. My brother had brain surgery 3 weeks ago. He was talking to the surgeons as they were working on his brain. Cannot feel your own brain. Isn't that amazing? It can feel everything but itself. Wow, who designed that? What a great idea. Anyway, Marion Diamond's work. She set up 2 cages for rats. And in this cage, she made the rats work. If they wanted to eat, they had to find the food. She had it in a maze. Do you know what a maze is? It's like backwards, forwards, turn the dead ends and all that. It was hard work. The rats would be sniffing that way, that way. And when they found the food, and then she would change the maze. And she made them build a nest. All the materials, bit of wool, bit of leather, some shavings, and the rats had to make their nest. And every day she destroyed it. They had to make it again. And if they wanted water, they had to push the buttons to get the drop of water. And she even had scary things like cats. You can't put a cat in there like a real one. But if the rat trod on the wrong part of the cage, how came that noise? The rats go, whoa, oh, be careful, be careful. So those rats worked. Over here, these rats is like on a holiday. Here's your food. Here's your nest, done. No cats, plenty of water. She gave them a few weeks, took a little bit of their brain. These guys, these rats, she goes, okay, yes, yes, yes. Let's take these out. They can go over there. Let's take these out. They can go over there. Now, give them a few weeks, see what happens. Guess what happened? Those guys now over here went like that. And these guys now over there went like that. She had discovered something that was to crush the old view forever. We are not born smart. We make ourselves smart. We have what is called plasticity, an incredible ability for our brain to change depending on how much work we give it. So I say to kids, which brain do you want? That one or that one? I've never yet had any kid anywhere say, I want that one. Every kid says, I want that. And I say, well, me too. I say, here's what we think. The best way to get that we know of is to play video games. And kids go, yo! And I say, they are so good at that if you play video games, even watch videos, anything else for your brain will be boring. You will drop out of school. You will give up learning things that are important but hard work. You will stop socializing with your brothers, your sisters, your parents. You drop out of teams. You'll become a person who so needs to be in front of that computer that you will drive everyone in your world almost insane. And kids say, no. Then some other people are saying, okay, let's put kids' lessons into computer games. So when they come to school, they've all got a tablet or a laptop and they play games to learn mathematics and second languages. And I say, be careful. Be very careful what you wish for. Because if you take the human out and you take the hard work out, you end up back here. It's just you're so stimulated by that. This is so powerful. You know, when I was growing up, I used to like watching a movie on the television. You had to wait for the television station to play that movie. Today, you can get it instantly. You can download it. I know 4-year-olds who've watched the same movie 30, 40, or 50 times. I know 5 and 6-year-olds who've watched 5 movies 100 times each. And you think, how many hours has that child sat in front of a television where their parents would have been using books, learning to colour and paint, playing in the mud, getting into trouble and getting out of trouble, all those things you learn. And these kids, video. And if you take away the video, and so the parents go, okay, you can have the video back. It is not the parents who has to make the change, it's the kids. And it's my job to convince them to do that. And I say, this is about maze changes, changing the maze. What at school and what at your home will grow that brain for you. And I ask kids to come up with a plan. How much reading will that involve? How much talking in your own language will that involve? How much talking in another language? How much community service? How much time with artist tools and musical instruments? Because if you don't have a plan, you'll get sucked into computers doing it for you. I think that's a tragedy. I'm going to stop talking for a minute and invite you to talk to people around you, close by you, about what this means for you. So you have 2 minutes, please. Talk to others about this. The older view was that we were smart because of our genes. Smart because of what our parents gave. Perhaps smart because of previous lives. There are many ways of looking at how that is configured. A newer way says it's about how you train your brain. It's about how motivated, how much you want something. And so with all of the children I work with, across so many different countries, I ask them 2 questions. Why do you come to school? And Why do some students do better than others? When I say, why do you come to school? There's about 4 different responses. Some kids say, I come to school because I have to. My parents force me. I don't want to go, but they make me. Some say, I come to school to learn. Some say, I come to school to see my friends. It's a social place. It's like fun. It's better than being home. And if you learn, that's nice. If you don't learn, who cares? Some say, I come to school because I want further education. I want school. Then I want education beyond school. It might be university. I want to learn throughout my life. So that's important because the answer to that helps answer this one. And that's way more complex. These are the ideas that kids have given me. And some of these words are adult words. I just take the kids' words and turn them into adult words. So kids don't usually say motivation. Kids say care factor. Care factor low. Care factor high. Motivation. They say that is more important than intellect. Intellect is how smart you are. So I ask kids, what does a smart person do that a not so smart person can't do? And they say the smart kids learn the same thing in less time and with less mistakes. That's a kid view of what it's like to be smart. It's okay. It's good for me because I say, oh really? They're faster and they make fewer mistakes. I say, okay, so if I could teach you to learn faster and make fewer mistakes, would you be interested? And some kids go, yes. And other kids go, no. Why would anyone say no to being a really smart learner? The country where that happens most for me is South Korea. Because you see, if you are a smart kid in South Korea, your parents are going to put a lot of pressure on you. Because if you're already smart, you get just a wee bit smarter, you get into the best universities. Not just in South Korea, but in other countries of the world. And in South Korea, if you've gone to a top university, you actually get a better salary when you're working than someone who has the same degree but from a university that's not as good. It's prestige. Parents say, my child got into the best university. Hey, I'm good. So kids say, it's best not to be too smart. So you're smart enough, and then you stop. Because if you're too smart, if you finish quickly, they'll give you more work. Isn't that fascinating? I have a son who is like that. Yes, Matthew Joseph, lovely man. I have a daughter who tried to be as smart as she possibly could. Always chose the top grades. Won scholarships at universities. My son, Matthew, he said, Dad, as soon as you pass, you don't need to do any more work. All you need to do is pass. Does anyone here have a son or daughter or a student who's like that? Just pass. How can two kids have the same parents, be brought up in the same house, and one says, pfft, and the other goes, yes, yes. Well, Matthew Joseph has a really, really, really good job. See, he said, Dad, when I'm learning something I'm interested in, then you'll see me get best grades. He earns a lot of money, and I mean a lot of money. He's on $150,000 US a year. His sister, who has a master's degree in history and speaks 3 languages, is unemployed. Because we have thousands of young Australians who have a master's degree in history and speak 2 or 3 languages. Can you see what we've done in our country? We've tried to get everyone to go to university to get the best grades they can, and there's no jobs left at that level. So those who learn to do trades, to build the houses, to do the hard work, guess what? Top income. That doesn't work here in India. I know that doesn't work here in India. I don't know how that would work in Tibet. I don't know. In many parts of the world, the university degree is still the best education you can have. But we have to be careful not to think it's the only education. I'll come back to some of these. This is what interests me. Motivation and confidence. The 2 elements that students say are the most important in learning, providing you're reasonably smart. Motivation, how much we want something. Confidence, our belief in our capacity to get it. So, I would like to be a better musician. I play guitar. And I've had a lot of training in guitar, and I'm still pretty bad. Maybe it's my teacher. I doubt it. I think it's me. My confidence is low. My teacher says, you can do it, and I go, no, I can't. He says, yes, you can. I say, no. Have you ever had a student like that? Yeah. Their confidence is low. Have you ever had a student whose confidence is high? I can do that, but they're not very good. Yeah. See how these work? So there's 5 types of learner using these 2. This one, I call an anxious learner. Anxious means always worried. Always, oh, is it good enough? Oh, because they're high in motivation but low in confidence. You know these students, or you might be parenting one. As soon as you ask these students to do something, they say, will you help me? In class, their hand is up all the time. They haven't even started and their hand is up. I need a hand. You say, have you given it a try? No, I know I will not be able to do it. They worry. All night they worry. They do homework, endless homework. Oh, might not be good enough, it's not good enough, it's not ready. They drive me mad when I was teaching. I was teaching some little kids, and they would colour in everything. It looked pretty. They'd even use little bits of glitter. They even use pens that have a little smell, like they smell like strawberries. So you open the book and it's, but the work is rubbish. It looks good. That's this. They worry about reports. Oh my gosh. They can't stand up in front of the group and explain what they want to explain because they think, I'll make a mistake. I'll get it wrong. I won't be able to do it. They are so nervous. They are lovely people, don't get me wrong. Lovely people to teach, but they need work. So here's my daughter, high flyer. High motivation, high confidence. Bring it on. When's the test? They love tests. Yes. They hate tests. Oh my gosh. They go, yes, 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 a test, yes. Because they know they're going to get it right. And they know they will get it wrong. So they love tests. They do not like working in teams. They cover their work. They sit like that. They put their hands, done. Even their friends can't see what they've done. Highly competitive, they can be highly stressed. Here's my son, competent. capable. Okay, school's school. If he gets a teacher he likes, A grade. Teacher he doesn't care for, bzz, underachiever. Same kid, just goes into a different class. How does that work? This child here, low motivation, low confidence. School sucks. Learning sucks. In schools, they are often put out of the class. You can go and sit over there. You can go out there. You can go and sit with the principal for a while. You can't come back. In my country, we have tens of thousands of these students who will disrupt the classes. And you know what? They're actually nice people. They just don't like school. And does that mean they don't have a future? No. It does not mean that at all. But they are not treated well. In the old view, they were hit with sticks and canes, put out in the cold. They got themselves into a lot of trouble. And so they reacted. Many of the people who are in prisons in Australia and in places like the UK, the USA, were these at school. And no one cared enough to shift them. These are just annoying because their confidence is high. I can do it. But their motivation is low. I will wait until tomorrow or next year or when I'm 30 or when I'm about to meet my maker. When I'm 90, I might get a bit interested, but not yet. And so they drive you insane. If you are a parent, you are on their case all the time. Have you got homework? Not really. What does not really mean? I'm not really going to do it. Yeah. So here's what I do with this. Every student I work with, whether they are 6 years or 30 years old, has to write one of these for every subject. And then they have to explain that to someone who is important in their life. So if it's a kid, that's their parent. And when we have parent-teacher interviews, you have to attend or your kid doesn't come back to school. Well, the parents come in real quick. I don't want him at home. Yeah, okay, I'm coming in. I say, okay, what did you circle for science? What did you circle for English? What did you circle for mathematics? And the child then has to explain to the parent which one of those they chose, because their grades are always related to their motivation and confidence. And our question is, what needs to happen to get you somewhere in this zone? That's the first question. The second question is, who in the school can help you to do that? See, they're great questions, because that modern view says that the student has responsibility as well as the teacher, whereas the older view had the teacher as responsible. And when it wasn't working, the teacher would get frustrated and hit the kid, or even the adult. Didn't matter. You got hit. Someone did something to you to try and motivate you. Motivation doesn't work that way. Quick chat again, please, with others. Which of these best describe you as a kid doing school? If you're here as a parent, where would you put your child or children? Where would you want them to be? Please have a chat. Let's continue. Thank you. Now, a group of us got very interested in this because we saw some patterns developing. We could link students' grades to where they link themselves in motivation and confidence. Then we wanted to see whether there might be some emotions that were linked to that as well. And so we developed some surveys, some questions, where we could get kids to give us what emotions they felt at school. And it became really clear that this group, who I call the high flyers, had different emotions to this group, which I call the underachievers. And here's what those emotions are. You have these in your notes. So the high flyers get enjoyment. Enjoyment is the feeling we get when we're doing the things that we want to do. So if you want to go walking and you get to go walking, it's enjoyable. But if you don't want to go walking and you have to go walking, it's not enjoyable. See how that works? So these kids have enjoyment as a dominant emotion, but they also have what I call fulfillment. Fulfillment is when you finish something that you really didn't want to do, but you thought, I should do it. For me, that would be like ironing my clothes. I don't enjoy ironing, but if I don't do it, it doesn't get done. So I do it. I don't enjoy washing my car. I can pay someone else to do it, but that's money, so I do it, but I don't enjoy it. But when I finish the ironing and I finish the car, now I will do something I enjoy. See how that works? And satisfaction. You can't buy that. You can only earn it. It is that incredible feeling you get when you have completed something that was really difficult, that was really worth going for. You've got it and it's... You don't even have to tell anyone. It's just an internal feeling that is extremely powerful. So for high flyers, they get these three emotions throughout the day. Doesn't mean they don't get any of these, but this is dominant. And then they develop self-talk. Self-talk is the conversation we have with ourselves. I don't know where it comes from. No one does. But self-talk is with us, and you cannot turn it off unless you are really talented at managing your mind. So these kids say, I can do it if I might be get support, get some coaching. I'm capable of, I'm good at. How can I do it? So they're looking for a strategy. What needs to happen? What are the steps I need to take? Who can help me? Who's my teacher? Who's going to give me feedback? It will take time. I don't care. I've got time. I care. Now look at this group. In my thinking, these are opposites. So the opposite of enjoyment is boredom. I'm being told to do things that I have to do that I don't want to do. And so I say, oh, this is boring. And if I say this is boring enough, it will create some excitement in someone else. And they will start giving me some threats. You'll do it now or you'll do it later. You do it now or you don't get any ice cream. You do it now or you will sit here for a month. You do it now or I will fail you. Grade 9 is going to be the best 5 years of your life. You're going to do it. See how that works? So they go for a bit of excitement. They get guilt. Guilt comes from avoiding. I didn't do it. I'm going through school. I'm not passing because I'm putting in no effort. Man, that's hard to deal with for a kid. So they use blame. It's not me, it's the teacher. The teacher's no good. It's not me. This is old stuff. They're asking me to learn stuff that's not relevant. These don't say that. They say do it. Someone who I value has said this is important, so I'm going to do it. And they say, no, I'm not. And then they're frustrated. I'm dumb, I'm stupid. My parents, I've let them down. I've let my teacher down. What am I going to be like as a parent? Some of these people give up their language. I can't do it. I'm dumb. I'm stupid. I'm no good. Why don't they? They never. He always. I give up. It's never going to happen. I don't care. I work with parents who are raising some of these kids. And they say, John, what am I going to do? And I say, well, it's not that difficult, really. To shift someone from here to here is not hard. I'll show you how I do it in a moment. Because once you've been here for a while, you don't want to go back there. Believe me, that sucks. At every level, that's bad news. Really bad news. So we've developed what we call a hope cycle. Hope and despair. And you know what? You could change these two words, if you want, into love and fear. And sometimes I use it in that way. Hope, despair, or love and fear. And see how I've made it as a Venn diagram. There's a middle section. There's crossover. Because what happens is this. When someone's here, and someone's here, and they're trying to counsel them, to help them, they will often try and find out why that person is there. And in doing so, they'll bring more of that despair into their own hope cycle. I've seen people give up, counsellors give up, and unfortunately, this person give up because now they're both in despair. I say, it doesn't really matter what got you there at this point. What matters is getting you there. I'll give you an example, a real life example of a 10-year-old boy who I was teaching in Thailand. We're cutting up the brains. He did okay. He was one of these. I could tell. You can tell very quickly if you get skilled at this. He did okay. I said, was that enjoyable? He said, yes. What made it enjoyable? He said, I'm trying to get him to work it through. He said, it was just great fun. I've never seen a brain. I found all the parts. Oh, give me 5. Whoa. Next thing to do, for their assessment, the students are given a lump of Play-Doh. Do you know what Play-Doh is? Like a modelling clay. And they have to build a brain. And all the parts have to be there, and they then have to explain what the parts do. He did a great job. Same? Was that enjoyable? Yes. Who do you want to show that to? He said, my mum. Do you think your mum will be satisfied with that? I used the language. He said, yes. I said, what does satisfaction mean for you? He said, she will be proud of me. What will make her proud of you? I've finished a task. I'm usually in trouble. I said, wow, this is fantastic, man. I said, I've got an idea. If we spray your model with hairspray, it will last for a century because it will stop the air getting to it. Would you like to keep that model like until you're an adult? Every time you look at it, you can feel that satisfaction. This kid is going, yeah? Yeah? The next task, a very complex one. He has to work with another group of kids to design a model to explain how learning happens. This is very, very hard work, higher order thinking. He gives a good idea. His friends say, your idea stinks. Your idea sucks, man. You're no good anyway, just because you build a good brain. Kids can be really hurtful. So he got into what I call his red room. He's come back over here. I've got him over here. He's back here. And I could see this kid. He's turning. And then he gets here. Oh no. He turns over the table. He picks up a chair. He starts attacking kids with the chair. I'm trying to calm him down. Hey, that was a good brain. And then he went to the brain that he had made out of Play-Doh. And he smashed it with his fist. You see, he felt uncomfortable here. He got so much of that in one morning that he went back here. Now teachers are rushing at this kid. He's only a little guy. They're rushing. Teachers everywhere. It's like the army's come in. And I said, no, do not touch that kid. Leave him. He sat under the table. The bell goes for lunch. All the kids go out. I say to a teacher, stay here. I'm going to work with that kid. I got under the table. I'm sitting under the table with this 10-year-old kid. I said, man, that was a really, really good brain that you built. He said, what? He was expecting me to go here. He was expecting me to tell him all the things that were wrong with him. And I said, oh, you really enjoyed that? You're ready for your mum? He said, oh, it's wrecked. I said, man, it's Play-Doh. You can't wreck Play-Doh. You just reshape it. I said, would it be okay if I helped you to rebuild that? Because I'm a bit like you. I need to get satisfaction as well from my job. I don't want to go home frustrated that I beat up on a kid because he's got issues in his life. He said, Mr. J, I would love it if you helped me. We rebuilt the model. He was cool for the rest of the day. He shut out that. He had one day in his life where he had felt that. And when he left, and his mum came to pick him up, and he showed her that model, and she said, how did he go? Expecting, oh, he's a little so-and-so. I said, he built a great model, he did a great job, and he got over a hurdle today that he would not believe he could get over. Be very proud of your boy. I don't know what happened to him. I don't go back. But I know he now knows that he can get there. And I'm suggesting it is the job of the parent, it is the job of the teacher, it is the job of the community, it is the job of the government to bring its citizens here. Because when you are here, that can never hurt you. But if you live your life here, you can't be there at the same time. I'll ask you to talk about that. What's the relevance of that for you? Who do you know that's here? And really would be better here. Back to you, please. 1 minute chat. Eventually, from our hope and despair or our love and fear cycles, we develop habits of thinking. We call habits of thinking concepts. So a concept, to our way of thinking, is an opinion that we put out there that we defend. We take a stand. Concepts can be very powerful. They can be very weak. A weak concept is easily shifted. You could be convinced by someone that your concept's not as good as theirs and therefore you change your mind. But some concepts we will die for. We will say, this is more important even than my own life. They are what I call emotionally powerful concepts. Here's an example of a concept, public speaking. I talk for a living, that's what I do. But I don't particularly like it. I'm scared of speaking. I don't look like it, because I've done 2,000 talks. But for my first 200, I had to go to the bathroom 10 times before every talk. Even now, I was saying to Kerry today, I need to be over here, there's a class. Yeah, but I need to be here, I need to set up, I need to make sure everything's working. You see? Some people's concept of public speaking is so strong that they can't do it. They know their stuff. They can talk to their friends, but on a stage, you can see how concepts work. They're very, very powerful. School, manners, politics, wealth, poverty, intelligence, religion. These become our concepts. And then we try and get our world to match our concepts of what that world should look like. And this, I believe, is the cause of almost all human conflict. Conflict between families, conflict between different groups, conflicts between nations. And you know about that. People will slaughter other people on the basis of concepts. A lot of my work is in the Middle East, in conflict zones. And I say, you've got to get the concepts right, guys. Till the concepts are acceptable for each group, you'll continue to slaughter. It's what happens. So I had a great opportunity in 2013 to visit Tibet, to work with a Rinpoche Lama, a Rimé master from Melbourne, Australia, who came to Australia under a refugee program. And we went to Tibet to scout locations to make a documentary of his life as a Jonang master. And we got all of the paperwork right. We did it all in Australia. We went to the Chinese embassy. We put in our paperwork. We said, here's where we're going, here's what we're doing, here's the story. And it was okay. We got our visas. We took off, and there was a group of us who, those of you who were in here earlier saw some of our photos. But every time we got to a monastery, we were moved out. Sometimes we were taken 30 or 40 kilometres down the road and dumped, even though we had the paperwork. You see, the concept of the people who were managing that part of the territory was different to the concept of the people who gave us permission to be there. And they hadn't communicated. So our papers meant nothing. You're here with cameras, video cameras. Not on my watch. It's how it fell apart. These are really powerful things to get a handle on, to understand. And they start in families. This is me. And this is supposed to be my daughter. And I love my daughter. She is just fantastic. But you see, I have a concept that a child's bedroom should be tidy. And she has a concept that how tidy your bedroom is no one else's business but hers. So when I see her bedroom and like there's clothes everywhere and there's bits of food and it stinks, I say, Lisa, you have to clean up this pigsty. You see, that is meant to inspire her. She goes, oh, Dad, yes, of course. She says, Dad, get over it. She says, Dad, I'll do it later. Dad, I'm not going to do it. And so then I use some guilt. What would your grandma think? I don't care. She's not here. And then I go, okay, I've had it with this bedroom. I'm going to count to 3. I don't know whether you guys count to 3, but we do that a lot. But you can't get to 3. You go 1, 2, 2.5, so 2 3/4, 2 5/8. Because you can't get to 3. If you get to 3, you've got to do something. You see how this works? And she thinks it's funny. So, what did we do? We buy a rat from the pet shop and we put the rat in her bedroom because she doesn't like rats. But it's like a pet rat. And when she comes home from school, we say, "We saw a rat in your room." And she goes, "You know." And I say, "Yes, it's there because it's a mess. Because it can hide. And there's food for years in there." And she says, "Oh my gosh, would you help me clean up the room?" I say, "Yes, I would love to. Let's do it together, like father-daughter time." Yes. But see, I haven't changed the concept. So it's going to get dirty again. The rat's gone. Then what do I do next? You see, it doesn't work. And you might be thinking, "I don't care about bedrooms." Well, because I work with so many kids, I say, "What do you fight about with your parents?" And there's a little list they make. I don't know what works for you guys in your homes, in your families. But it's probably some of these. You know, like what to eat and when to eat and how to eat and when to clean up and all that stuff. In Australia, it is very common for young children to be invited to their friend's home. You come over and you have a cake and you play games and you have a soft drink or something, and it happens a lot. So my kids, they're in front of the television and they've got their cake and their drink, and when they finish, they get up and they leave the mess. And I have to clean it up, or my wife has to clean it up. And I say, "I'm not your slave. You need to clean it up." And they say, "Oh yes, okay." But they don't. They don't clean it. And they get frustrated. And then they go to their friend's house. They get an invitation. And they finish their snacking and they go, "Ooh, I'm going to clean up. This will look so good." And they say, "Where do you like all of our rubbish put when we're finished?" And I drive over to collect my children. And the parents of their friends say, "Your children have lovely manners. They clean up when they're finished." And I go, "Really? Huh? They don't do that for me." So you see, when you're parenting, you have to say, if you do that at your friend's house, you will not get invited again. So, when you go there, make sure you clean up. And when you're here, let's go for 50%. We'll strike a deal, 50% clean up. You see, you start negotiating. My father didn't do that. If we didn't clean up, you got the stick. He would belt us so much that we would bleed. And I chose, being brought up in that family, to never, ever, ever do that to my children, because it wrecked my family. That you can do it. You can beat them up. You can chop their hands off. It'll just make their concepts more and more and more stronger. So look at all these things. Look, hairstyle. My father wanted me to have a haircut that looks very much like yours. I like your haircut. My father liked that. But this was the days of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And they had hair more like yours. And that's what I wanted. You know, long hair. And I love that sort of hair. So I grew my hair, and my father, oh my gosh, he would, and he would take the stick to me, and he'd say, "You cut it off or I'll cut it off." And I said, "No, I love it." One day I said to my father, this is an Australian term, I don't know whether it means anything to you. I said, "This is a chick magnet." Means it attracts the girls, you know. Like, the girls love this, Dad. He said, "You are not a chick magnet. This is disrespectful." He said, "Cut it off now, or I will change your name to a girl's name." See, my name is John. I didn't cut it. He changed my name to Joan, a girl's name. My letters would come. In those days, we didn't have internet. He'd cross off John, he would write Joan. He's saying, this one's for you, sweetheart. He used to introduce me to people as his daughter. I've got 8 brothers and sisters. We're a big family. And I was his girl now. And I said to him one day, I said, this is not working. You can't hit it off me. You can't cut it off me. I said, I'm going to make a deal. If you stop calling me Joan, I'll get at least half of it cut off. I won't wear a ponytail. He said, nothing doing, boy. He said, you get it cut, and when I'm happy, I'll decide when to stop calling you Joan. I said, you and I are now at war. I did not get a haircut for 9 years. When I was married, my hair was here. I love telling kids that story, and I show them all the photos, and they're like absolutely on the floor with laughter. And I say, it's all about concepts. Had my dad said, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, they look cool. Have a go. Don't go too long, but yeah, let's find, I would have been happy. But no, he had to be the boss. Doesn't work. Look at all these things. Look. What are you going to do with some of these? If you're raising kids, drugs, alcohol. I find my son's been smoking marijuana. I hate marijuana. I think it's really bad news. What am I going to do? Am I going to punch him in the face like my father would have done? No. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to give him a science lesson on this. I'm going to show him what happens. I'm going to show him how the drug works, how long it stays in his system, and what it does to his mind, and how he will lose his job, because in the work he does, they do random drug tests a lot. And in the end, he says, Dad, I think you're right. But I had to try it. Everyone's doing it. I say, yeah, Matt, I know everyone's doing it. Now everyone's doing ice. And our hospitals are full of young people who are dying. And our prisons are full of younger and older people who are making the stuff. Someone has to say no. And if you don't educate people, they don't know how to say no. This one's an interesting one, tattoos. This is a growth industry. I don't know about here, but in my country, our sporting stars have got their sleeves of tattoos. Like they're completely covered in tattoos. My daughter comes home one day, she says, Dad, I'm thinking of getting a tattoo. I didn't even know why I said this, but I said, hey, cool idea, Lisa. I think we should get a family one. She goes, what? I said, yeah, I'm going to put I love Lisa right across here. Because when you're about 80 or 90, you've got to lift your skin to read that. She's going, oh, Dad, that is sick. I said, don't go without us. She said, I don't think I'll go. You see? Which ones of these are you dealing with? If you're a parent, you've been raised by parents, or you're in a monastery, it doesn't matter. There's concepts everywhere. And then there's consequences for breaking them. I'll give you a minute to chat on that. Because I think this is what a newer education is about. It's not about the adults the boss, the abbots the boss, the prime minister's the boss. It's we're all the boss. We've got to work together, take responsibility as collective. Please have a quick chat about that. Let's continue, thank you. 4 models describe our work. We invented all of those 4 models, and I'm going to go through 3 of them very briefly with you. If I was working with a group of teachers over a period of time, this would take quite a few days. With a group of students, it would take at least a day to do one of these models. So in this I call the emotional rooms, and I constructed it because I had bowel cancer, and both of my parents had died from the bowel cancer that I had. And my surgeon wanted to do the same thing to me as had happened to my parents. Operation and then chemotherapies. And he gave me less than a year to live. And I said, I don't want to do that. I've got 2 young children and you've just given me a death sentence. I said, is there anyone in the world who has the same cancer I have, who did not do chemotherapy and who survived? I thought that was an okay question. And he said, I don't know. And I got really angry. I said, what do you mean you don't know? You are a surgeon. You are treating people who have life-threatening illnesses, and you haven't looked anywhere else? He said, we do case studies. There are thousands of people just in Australia who have that. We look at all of their cases. Here's where you are at. You will die. And I said, no, I won't. Because I'm going to go out and find the people, myself, who didn't die, and find out what they did. And that's what I did. I'm now betting my life on this. And I found that these people used incredibly powerful thought processes. You might call it meditation, visualization. They were able to get their immune systems strengthened through visualization, through changing diet, through exercise, through laughter, through love of close friends. Clearly I survived. I have some issues. I have a bag which I wear because I don't have a bowel left. So that's what I do, and I've been doing that for 18 years. And I teach people about cancer. I don't say, if you do that, you'll survive. I'll say, but you should look at that as an alternative. And then my surgeon, because I survived, asked me to teach surgeons. What did you do? How did you do that? So I made that model. And in my model, I said, we have a green room. This is critical, logical, analytic, cognitive. It's all in the mind, highly prized. But we also have a creative, imaginative, dreaming, possibilities mind. And I had to work here. Can I imagine my own body healing itself? Now, some people say, you're crazy if you do that. And I say, well, 3/4 of the world is crazy because Western medicine isn't really that good. We wait for the illness before we treat it. Most other people treat to avoid the illness in the first place. So you got that right. You can manage your emotions. My emotion was fear. Someone tells you you're going to die. You've got a partner, you've got a couple of kids, you've got 40 or 50 years ahead of you, and you don't want to die? They fill you full of fear. You do almost anything. I had to get rid of the fear. The fear had to go. I watched movies that made me laugh. I have friends just say, you've got to tell me some cancer jokes. How can you tell a cancer joke? It's not funny. I said, you've got to do that. You've got to do that. You've got to get me laughing. Got to find a way to strengthen this. I had to keep out of my red room, this anger bit. Why me? What did I do? What mistakes did I make in a past life that have given me this one this time? I've got to overcome all this stuff. Yeah? You have to. And I learned so much here. I teach this model to kids. Kids love it. They love it because kids are really skilled at red room. Really skilled. How does a newborn let his mum or dad know what it wants? Kid doesn't say, oh, I'd like to have some milk, please. They can't even talk. So they get in the red room. Okay. Someone's holding them, they've had enough. Let it go, I've had enough of you. Give me back to mum. They'll go, You see? And then kids start to get some of this happening. And they don't need that so much. But they have to learn this. I don't know about you, but when my kids are growing up, we go past the shop, and the shop sells ice creams. And ice creams are like all these big colours and flavours and all this music going, and there's ice creams everywhere. And the kids say, I want an ice cream. And I say no. I don't know why I say no, I said no. And my son, he goes, I want an ice cream! Because he's thinking, if I get Dad here with fear, so I'll grab him by the arm. And I say, you're not getting an ice cream. So he stiffens up, he's like a piece of timber. He's like, and I'm trying to pull him, and he's leaning back like this. And all these people are watching. And he says, you'll break my arm again. And I'm feeling like, I'll break your arm in a minute, man, you keep that up. And so I pick him up, and I've got like his ankles are here, and he's straight up. I put him in the car, and there's no ice cream today. He never did that again. Never, ever, ever did that again. I've seen so many parents say, okay, I'll get an ice cream. What does the kid learn? Yeah. You want ice cream? Scream. You get it. I can't believe the things that some parents let their kids do. I think, oh, wow, you're going to have problems for 30 years with that kid. Because you let them take the power here, and now you got fear here. So yeah, okay, you can watch a video. Okay, you can play computer games for another 1 hour. I'll say, no, computer games go off, man, 8 o'clock. Yeah? If you don't turn it off, I take the plug. And you don't get it back for a week. Want to test me? Come on. Kid goes, okay, it's going off at 8. Okay, cool, we've got a contract. If the kid's hard, I say, we signed the contract. Next year you can go till 8:30. Do you see? I'm not being mean. Am I? I'm being a parent. So that model, for a lot of kids, they love it. But here's what happens, because it links back to concepts. So I've got a concept. It's about snakes. Some people like snakes. I've tried to like them. I even had one for a pet. I even took it to school with me and gave it to the kids to play with. It was a nice snake, but I was always scared of it. I don't like them. So next to my home is a big park, and in there live snakes. Did you know in the world there are 13 deadly snakes? 11 of them live near my home. 11 out of 13 deadly snakes. And I have a friend who likes to go trekking, walking through the bush. She likes snakes. She grew up on what we call in Australia a sheep station. Big land, a lot of sheep, a lot of snakes. She used to go to bed with a shovel, a really sharp spade. And if a snake would come in, I know that's not good for your people, but that's what she would do, because it would kill. If it bites you, it kills you. So she'd kill it. So she says, let's go for a walk. And I said, no, there's snakes. She said, you have to overcome your fear of snakes. I said, if I stay here, I don't have to have the fear. She took me with her. We turned the corner, and there in front of me is a king brown. You got about an hour and a half after that thing bites you before you're dead. It didn't bite me. I've gone. You see, it's the red room. Fight, flight, or freeze. I freeze. I don't know why, I just freeze. I'm hoping the snake thinks I'm a statue. But my friend, she has the fight. So she chases it. And the snake's moving away from it. How does a snake know that that person is more powerful than it is. If I chased it, it would bite me. She chases it, goes. I go, that's incredible. She says, keep going. I say, no, I'm going back. Come on. She takes my hand. Next corner, another snake. Little one, baby. She just picks it up. Gone. I go, my heart is like a boom, 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 boom. Next corner, it's a stick. It's not even a snake, it's a stick. But my brain goes, it's a snake. I go over a stick and she's just doubled. Every time I walk that path where those snakes were, years later, when I get to that corner, I go, see how this thing works? Have you ever walked into a spider's web at night? You're walking and all of a sudden, you've got a web. Most people go crazy. And then the next night, you come out, you go, whoa, Spider-Man lives there. Because your brain prepares you for it. Once you've had the experience, the brain has the expectation. Now something incredible happens next. The blue room feeds the orange room and says, we need to be aware, vigilant, hypersensitive, ready to deal. What happens is, when we get stressed, after the stress passes, we drop back to our proper breathing, blood pressure, all of the chemicals in our body. We're back to what we call a stable baseline. Scientists have a word for that, homeostasis. However, if you continue in that stressful environment, your body adjusts your stable baseline so that you're ready to deal with a threat. We call that allostasis, an adjusted, stable baseline. And it can happen at a national level. It has probably happened to Tibetan people as a result of the experiences that many of you have been through. An allostatic load has you primed to live outside of your comfort zone. I'm in a different country, but I have relatives there. What's happening? So we constantly live in a state of hypervigilance, so we are ready to respond very quickly. This happens with children. In Australia, it is happening with children as young as 3 or 4 years of age. But their experiences are not like yours. Their experiences are coming from the internet, from the games that they play, from the unending news reports that they hear about the conflicts all over the world, and the stranger danger campaigns that we run. So our kids, in many cases, are so full of fear that they're living their lives like this. As are teachers. Teaching is a high allostatically loaded profession. Everyone wants kids to be doing better. More kids getting better grades. More people doing that, more of that. More rules, more road rules, more taxes, more this, more that, until it becomes to a point of where people are so allostatically loaded that you see people unable to function anymore. I can't do my job. I'm snapping at my best friend, my partner. I'm snapping at my kids, my colleagues. I'm going to derobe. I've had enough of this. I can't stand it anymore. And in many cases, it comes back to the allostatic load that people have. If you're carrying an allostatic load, you'll know it because you're superhuman. You don't need much sleep. You can take on more tasks in your work than you've ever taken on before. You can manage other people like you've never done before. You can work without an income. You go to sleep, you don't need an alarm clock. You just wake up. Bing! You don't wake up slowly. Oh my gosh, it's another day. You're like, wow! I ring people who I know are allostatically loaded in the middle of the night. Only sometimes, because they get angry. When they answer the phone, they go, hi! As if they've been awake for an hour or more. They just, ping! And they're ready to run again. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the pressure that is put on kids to perform well at school, to get better grades, so their nation looks better than someone else? And you don't give them a childhood because of pressure. What happens with allostatic loads? Poorer thinking, weaker creativity, reduced brain growth. Those dendrites shrivel away. Poorer social skills, increased pressure on heart, increased pressure on concentration, poorer motivation, increased frustration. You know what? If you retire, you stop work suddenly after you've been carrying an allostatic load, you go into the high risk category for dying within 6 months. That's okay if you want to die within 6 months, a good way to do it. But if you want to live and you carry an allostatic load, don't retire. We have people dropping dead at work with allostatic loads. Massive blood pressure fluctuation, increased risks of cancer. The cells in the body age at least 1.5 or more times our chronological age. That means if you're 40 years of age, you've been carrying an allostatic load for the last 20 years, your body's at least 50 years of age. That's scary. Do you know anyone in your life who's carrying an allostatic load? Again, you people are probably the world's best at managing this. At least that's what the world thinks. Tibetan people, calm, able to handle crises. Learn how to meditate, learn how to relax, learn how to manage their body functions. Is that true? Do young people today take that on as well? Is it being lost from your culture? Because if it is, I would suggest bringing it back would be a good thing to do. Can I ask you to chat briefly about this, please, before I talk about the role of sleep in this? Back to you. Let's continue, thank you. 2 bits to go before we complete our 2-hour workshop. The second of the models that we have developed, we call the 4 worlds. In the 4 worlds, we tried to construct a model that young people could relate to. It's about how we learn, how we develop spiritually, and it's about our future, making plans for what is uncertain. So in the 4 worlds model, we say there are 4 ways of knowing. The way I know myself, the way I know my world through indirect experience, that's like reading about it. The way I know the world through direct experience, that's like directly interacting with it, going places. And the way I picture my future, where do I fit in this scheme? So world 1, my inner world. I've constructed this world in my mind from all of the experiences that I've had. And so I reflect on that. It's about my level of happiness. It's about my concepts and my beliefs, my biases, my prejudices, my loves and my fears. This world is mine and mine alone. I share what I choose to share with others, and the rest I keep to myself. So it is private. Lives, grows, dies with me, and then what happens next forms my concepts and beliefs. So I think the number one job of a teacher, of a parent, of any adult in a community that involves young people is to contribute to the health of that person's world one. And that does not mean you've got to be nice all the time. It means sometimes you've got to hold a line. There's teaching that might not be comfortable. If we have a healthy world one, I believe we've had a good life. World two. The world I learn about through direct experience. I interact with this world. I see it through my senses. I feel it. I touch it, taste it, I smell it. It's physical, it's practical. I use tools, I use materials. They're world two. I construct my art and my craft here. My music and my sporting talents are here. They develop over time. In this world I cook, I repair, I maintain. When we are born, we only have world two because you need a language for world three that is not yet well enough developed to share with others. So little kids walk and crawl and taste and touch and build and so on. And tragically, in the education system in Australia, we are taking out world two. We're getting rid of sports and arts and cooking classes and practical science classes. We're wanting our 5-year-olds to sit at desks and to write and to read. And I would say that part of being human is to go, to be with, and to develop skills. World three, we don't know of any other animal with a brain that can do world three like humans. We have developed language. We can put our thoughts into words and symbols, and we can send them down from generation to generation. And again, I think it's fair to say Tibetans have done that better than any other culture in this world. I could be wrong, but that's what I think. So I look at world three and I think, wow, how fantastic is that? For me to be able to know about someone who lived 5,000 years ago because someone took the time to write that. And that's what teachers do. We teach kids about things that have happened. We teach kids how to use numbers in powerful ways. But we can overdo it. If you have too much world three, for people who aren't that interested in world three, you rob them of an education. My son was a world two kid in a world three school. You see, he wanted to develop his skills with tools, with equipment. But the school wanted him to develop his skills through thinking and reading and writing. And he said, I'll do it until I pass and then stop, until I can learn the things I really want to learn. See how that happens? Where did he get that from? Me. I was a World 2 kid in a World 3 school. So when I got to 14, I said, forget it. I'm not doing this anymore. I left school. I did not pass grade 10. I did a trade. A trade is where you go to a different type of school and learn to use your hands. My skill is in plastering. So you look at these walls and that plaster is covering the bricks. And that's what I learned to do. And all that beautiful fancy work that you have around your buildings, beautifully painted, I can do all of that. I did that for 11 years. I was a very good plasterer. And I got sick of it. And so I decided to go to university and become a teacher. But because I was motivated and confident about my ability to learn, I said, I'm going to do mathematics and science to master's degree level. Having never done grade 10, grade 11, or grade 12, science and mathematics. And I completed my master's degree in half the time that was allocated for me. Now, I knew that I had to learn by direct experience. So when I had my science lecturers, I said, look, I'm very good at plastering. I can also tile your bathroom, put ceilings up in your home, build you verandas. If you teach me what I need to do in your time, I will renovate your home free of charge. What do you think they said to that? What would you say to a student who said, I want to learn this, I want you to teach me really, really well, and there's some payback? So I graduated from that, and I tell kids that. So I have a master's degree in mathematics and science after dropping out of school at grade 10, and I've now worked in 29 countries teaching people about how their brains work. And they go, wow, you must be a genius. And I say, no, I'm no smarter or less smart than anyone else. I know how to learn. And I know if you put a combination of World 2 and World 3 together, you will learn in a very powerful way. And that's what I did. So I knew what I wanted to do. My World 4 was open. I want to teach. So my questions were, how can I do that? Who can help me? When's it going to start? It's 7 years to do that degree. How can I do it in 3.5? What happens next? We actually get students to make a personal learning plan based on this. We have developed an online instrument, which I cannot show you tonight because I've got a problem with accessing the internet here. But I'll give you a password so you can do it. Where kids and adults can measure their World 2 versus World 3 through a series of questions. And they can measure whether they prefer critical thinking or creative thinking through a series of questions. And it will give them a profile which is a snapshot in time. It's not fixed, it doesn't box people in. And they can look at that and go, wow, look at me. We've interviewed people from 300 different occupations, and we've made a profile for all 300 of the people who are most successful. So now a kid's got a profile, it's like a little triangle. And they go to the career section and I wonder what an accountant's profile looks like. They click on accountant, up comes the profile with their profile next to it. You might be 40%, 50%, you might be 90% matched. Does that mean you should be an accountant? No. It just means that you have what we call the attributes. The learning won't be difficult. You'll probably enjoy it. As soon as you do that, kids start to picture a future. We're working with governments in countries around the world to get kids profiling what they want to do so that you don't have what Australia and many other countries have, high graduate unemployment. You know what? If you get in a taxi in Australia, the taxi driver most likely has come from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. That person, in almost every case, has a university degree. Engineering, medicine. There are so many people who have those degrees in these countries who cannot get work. So they shift to another country and drive a taxi to give their kids a chance at getting a better education. And I say, if a country knows that it's got 10,000 too many lawyers, why would you let anyone do law? Crazy. And if they want to do law, say, okay, it costs you more to do law because we actually need people who can plaster buildings and so on. I'll give you the web address for that when we finish and a license so you can get into it. It doesn't cost you anything. It's written in English, but if anyone in this room is interested, Sam and I would love to work with a team of people who would like to write a Tibetan version of this so that the questions are more appropriate and so that the careers are the ones that you want Tibetan kids to move into, so that when that day comes, that your country is once again your country, you have a global citizen population that can take on the jobs. It's exactly what didn't happen in South Africa and exactly what we are trying to do in the Middle East. It's really important, I believe, for that to be the case. Quick chat, please, about this, what that means, and then I'll finish with just a little bit on sleep. Okay, back to you for 1 minute. It may or may not be a problem for you. I don't know. I don't know enough yet about what's happening in this part of the world. But in most countries I work in, poor sleep patterns for adults and for children are the health issue of the times. More and more people are getting less and less sleep. So when we cut open the brains with students, they can find a little bulb here. It's one of the few brain parts that works on its own. It's just a single piece. Mostly you get a mirror image. But this little part, which used to be thought by scientists to be our soul, because there's just a little bit. So they take it out. Didn't affect what was happening, but it had a major impact on sleep. Now we know that this thing produces and releases melatonin. Melatonin makes us feel sleepy. You're starting to get some into your system now. So by about 10 o'clock tonight, usually for most adults, that's where it peaks. In the morning when you wake, you have almost no melatonin, and for the rest of the day. It has an enemy, light. When there's a lot of light around, melatonin production is messed up. Let me tell you why this is important. The work of Renato Sabatini. Using brain scans, Sabatini established 5 levels of memory. Basically, I'm going to give you a very quick view of this. There's immediate memory, working memory, long term. We'll talk about those 3 levels. He wanted to know the role that sleep played in this. So using things such as words from a new language, he would teach people those words while they were in a brain scanning machine. Subsequently, that's been done with things like telephone numbers. To get the image, sugar is injected into the bloodstream. Sugar is our brain's fuel. If you put a radioactive trace on it, you can see where it's going. the machine can see what brain part's using the sugar. The brain part that does the most work gets the most sugar. So the words given to the person, you see an increase in activity here. The person's brain's trying to make sense of it. Through practice, using the word in sentences, in context, spelling it, you're now using working memory. This is hard work. If you're teaching someone, about 20 minutes before they get really tired. If you're teaching little kids, their age plus 2 in minutes. It's a guide. 5-year-olds can handle about 7 minutes, in other words. Once here, working memory, you've got to sleep. While we sleep, the brain rebuilds the memory on different dendrites to construct long term. How do we know that? Because when you pull the person back in a few weeks after they've done the learning and they recall it, it's a different brain part. So we've actually learnt it once, twice, 3 times. See how that works? So now what the researchers do is they do that, and then they stop the person from sleeping for 24 to 48 hours. They keep them awake. Then they call them back a couple of weeks later, ask them to recall, there's nothing there. They can't recall it. It's as if that never happened. So, that's an extreme case, but missing an hour or 2 sleep per night, night after night after night, does that to people. It weakens their performance on memory. Research is showing, and there's a lot of research studies showing this, a drop in sleep for males and females. Now it's about an hour and a half per night, less for a kid than what we got when we were the kids' age. So within a single generation, most kids have wiped out an entire night or 2 nights of sleep. What does that mean? Hard to know. Got to do long-term studies. Basically, sleep is divided into 2 stages. REM, non-REM. REM, very close to waking state. Most dreaming occurs here. If you wake someone here or train yourself to wake, which I did, you can actually write down what you were dreaming about. You can actually go back in and restart the dream on occasions. Throughout the night, the REM sleeps get longer and the non-REM sleeps become lighter. This is a great time to wake because during this REM sleep, the brain releases a memory fixative, acetylcholine. If you wake here, you're still easy to wake, but you haven't done your last bit of learning. If you try and wake someone here, especially a kid, good luck. You'll have to call them 2, 3 or 4 times. They will be grumpy. Some kids are waking here or here. That's bad news. Really bad news. How do you convince kids to get a good night's sleep? Here's how we do it. We photograph them. We stick a camera above their bed and we do time lapse. 1 photograph every 30 seconds. You don't want a video camera, it's useless. 1 photo every 30 seconds. Put those together, 25 frames a second, and you get an entire night of sleep in just a few seconds. You're going to see a boy called Sean in grade 8 being time-lapsed while he's sleeping. This is a perfect night's sleep. You will then see the same boy in grade 12 after he got seriously into computer games. Let's watch him. He knows he's being filmed. Throughout the night, he tosses and turns, covers and uncovers his body, trying to manage his body temperature. And as it gets close to morning, his eyes start to move under his eyelids. REM sleep. rapid eye movement sleep. 4 or 5 times per night we enter REM, we get very hot. I'll show you again. Did anyone notice in that video a poster falling off his bedroom wall and falling across his bed? There it is. Did anyone notice that? No. You see, the brain doesn't expect it, so the brain eliminates it. Isn't that interesting? We only see what we're conditioned to see. He kicks it into the wall. Unfortunately, we had our microphone taped here because we record what people say while they're sleeping. We play it back to them while they're awake. It's really cool. You don't want to do that, I can tell you now, because people say amazing things when they're asleep. See how he's uncovered? Body temperature. But Sean holds on to the blanket. So when he turns over, he pulls it back with him. See, non-REM, he gets cold. But he's got to have a little bit of his body out. Some people use an ankle, a knee, a shoulder. Something goes out just to get the temperature just right while we're asleep. Kids often do this with their feet. So the covers end up somewhere else in the room. And then they get cold and shiver and go and climb into bed with mum or dad or something. Now let's watch him when he's grade 12. Same kid. Sick every day. My grades have dropped. I've dropped out of music and sport. I said, okay, I'll bet you're playing computer games, aren't you? He said, of course. I said, okay, you can play computer games, but don't play them before you go to bed. He said, why not? That's what I do. I said, that's wrong. I said, tell me what happens. Grade 12. So I come home from school, I have something to eat, I do 4 or 5 hours of homework. He's highly motivated. Then I do a bit of Facebook. Then I play computer games and I go to bed about 2 o'clock. I said, no, you're up at 7. 5 hours sleep, probably 4 hours. Most of your night is going to be doing computer game stuff because it's more interesting for your brain than school. He said, oh, it's no good. It's okay. We'll film you and show you what happens and then you can make a decision. We filmed a lot of kids who are like this. You'll see when he goes to sleep, his fingers are still playing the controls. You'll see when he turns over, his shoulders are shaking. His brain is working so hard on the computer game that he needs more oxygen. So instead of breathing slowly through his nose, you can actually see his chest moving. And his rapid eye movement, which is really hard to pick up, it took scientists decades to notice this. His eyes are like bzzz, as he's trying to compress all that learning into just a few hours. Now, because this is time lapse, a few seconds of this is a few minutes in real time. Let's watch. Watch his fingers and thumbs. And as he turns over, his shoulders. Remember, this is going on for quite a few minutes in bed. He's breathing through his mouth. He's got to lie on his back to get more oxygen in. Rapid eye movement all night. And just before he wakes, his eyes. When I showed him that after he woke, he had tears welling up in his eyes. He said, you faked it. I said, you can't fake it. It's just a whole series of photos put together. And my usual question, what do you want to do about that? He said, show it to all the other grade 12s. Because we play games together, and if I'm playing them, I know they are. So about 150 grade 12s, I showed it to him and said, who is this a problem for? Almost every hand went up. Some kids say, I fight with my parents every night. So now I wait for them to go to sleep. Then I get up and turn on the computer when they're asleep. It's amazing. This is happening with kids as young as 6, by the way. It's incredible what is happening here. So I showed it to those students and I said, if you want, I can teach you what to do. They said, we want. I said, okay. Come home from school, play computer games. Work out with your parents for how long? 7, 8 o'clock, whatever, that's it, cut. If you can't manage it, write a contract with your parents that it's okay for them to take your computer away or whatever. Always do homework last. Homework is the last thing you do before you go to sleep, because your brain always starts on whatever you did last. Have you ever watched a movie and then gone to sleep? Your brain's playing that movie. You're in the movie, you're a character in the movie. You can't help it. It's how the brain works. Always get to bed before midnight. Earlier the better. Get up early in the morning rather than stay up late at night, or you waste your melatonin. I need to stop, I've gone over by a little bit. What we've given you is a tiny taste of what we do with students globally. And we're hoping, if you are interested, that what we can do here is teach you guys how to do this with your students. Because for me, to create a global citizen today, we need to look at the newer views without losing the older views that have got us to where we are now. Thank you for giving up 2 hours of your life.